My guest this week is Achuthan Prasad, a trainee teacher.
I think the extremely low-level thing which I would get, I was constantly said, "Oh, you look like a teacher we had last year." And the only connection was that he was brown as well. Initially, it was really difficult. When this new policy came out, it was a huge shock to my system, and it was a very existential moment for me. I've tried to call other people out on it, because it is those small things which, if you keep brushing off, they can just become the norm.
What does it mean to be a migrant?
Basta immigrazione! Abbiamo uno stato sociale al collasso!
What does it mean to leave your home, your family, your friends, and your language behind?
My mummy says you hate foreigners.
No.
Everyone migrates for a different reason. Some voluntarily, to gain new perspectives, experience new cultures, or earn a better salary.
We are a nation of immigrants.
And others involuntarily, to flee war, disease, or environmental disaster.
A one-nation experiment in open borders.
But there is one reason that links all migrants. No matter who you are, you migrate in search of something better.
O es la contribución real de los migrantes a nuestra economía.
Today, we hear so much about migration, but we never hear from the migrants themselves. Welcome to the podcast, where migrants answer what it means to be a migrant, writing an entry into our Migrant Diaries in the process.
I say Romanian and you start talking about people traffickers.
All written entries to the diary can be read on our Substack for free. Thanks so much for being here, and welcome to Moving, the Migrant Diaries podcast.
Les frontières à l'entrée de l'Union européenne seront fermées.
The first line of your diary entry is, "Why do I feel foreign in my home country?"
Mm-hmm.
What is your home country? And why do you feel like that's such a foreign place for you?
So I'm from India. When someone asks me where I'm from, I always feel the need to say I'm from Kerala as well, specifically. I just think India almost feels like saying I'm from Europe. So I just need to say I'm from Kerala. So yeah, that's where I'm from. And why do I feel foreign there? I mean, first of all, I've only lived there 3 years of my life. 3 years at a stretch. I think recently, having gone through pictures, I realized actually a lot of my childhood was spent there during summer holidays, during other things. So I have spent a decent amount of time there, but I feel foreign in my home country, mainly just because at this stage of my life, I just culturally, I feel so much more aligned with where I've been for the last 6 years of my life, the schooling that I did, which is English. So yeah, when I go back to India, as much as I have so many things about me that are very, very Indian, many parts of me, I don't want to get politics kind of entwined in there as well, but like moral sides and like kind of, yeah, political things I find so strange and crazy to me when I go back to India, which I don't feel in other parts of the world. So yeah.
Okay. And what do you remember about the time you did spend in India? Do you have any memories of the time you spent in India?
So before the 3 years which we lived continuously in India, when my family moved back, I was 10. So I was there from 10 to 13. Before that, going to India was all about family. Family, family, family. It was never going to explore the culture, which my parents did try to do, but during the summer holidays, in our heads as kids, it was just, oh, this is a family trip, and it's going to be a chore to go and meet all these family and relatives. And as much as our grandparents and all the relatives poured out so much love for us, it just seemed like a chore. There were fun aspects, hanging out with cousins, etc. But yeah, it tended to be at that stage of my life, I think perhaps because I went to an English school and I saw my English friends doing all their fun things and I wanted to fit in. Spending time with family in India didn't fit in with what was the norm or what was cool amongst them. So I think that has shifted a lot in my kind of perception of time in India. Now I really look forward to spending my time in India with family and doing other things. But I think growing up, that was the difference.
Okay. And so your first language wasn't English, is that right?
No.
Okay. So now that we're jumping ahead a little bit, but now that you are reconnecting more, taking more enjoyment in reconnecting with your family ties, how does that linguistic difference manifest itself? How is it having grown up with a language, Malayalam, and then that having developed to the point where you're now so much further away from your home country that's no longer, I mean, how would you describe your Malayalam skills now?
So that's a very interesting question. And my brother, in his very eloquent manner, expressed how it's affected him. And I think once he mentioned that, I realized how much it affected me as well. The issue, or kind of the complexity I face with my mother tongue, Malayalam, when I go back to India is I'm not able to convey my true personality with Malayalam. I can speak it, I can communicate with it. I'm very much able to get by. So I'm able to kind of get by. I'd say I'm fluent in the sense, like I can read the letters, I can understand, like if someone's speaking to me in Malayalam, I can understand what they're saying and I can generally speak it, but I'm not able to express my, the nuanced opinions, the complexity. So that's where I feel a bit that it holds me back, which is frustrating. Whereas in English, I can feel like I can really express myself.
Okay. And can you remember learning English for the first time then? Because if you grew up firstly without any English, and then you've become so fluent and so integrated into the English culture that you've started losing your roots in a way. Do you remember how that transition has been?
So I don't know if I remember it. Well, okay. I'll preface this by saying this is something I've had to look into very recently. So the head of the PGCE course is also an EAL teacher, she's a MFL teacher, and she wanted someone to talk about their English as a second language experience. So I had to get in touch with my mum and kind of reminisce what that was like for me. I think because it was primary school, it was year one, it wasn't that much of a leap. We were 4 or 5 years old, so they were, a couple of years at English ahead of me. I don't think it felt like a real barrier. And the EAL experience for me was very fun. It was a few of us. We went into this little cabinet and it was like learning English through dramatization and singing and stories. So it was fun. It didn't feel like we were disadvantaged because we didn't speak English fluently. So yeah, I don't have many strong memories, but I don't have any memories of not knowing English.
Okay. Yeah. And moving forward then in your life, do you remember the first time where you were aware that you were yourself a migrant, or that you yourself were taken out of your home and put somewhere? Because you've migrated, let's say, as a child as well as an adult in many different contexts, right? So your life is more defined by migration than home. So
that's a very good question. I think in Oman and the UAE, it wasn't something that really occurred to me. I guess just because family was here, so it felt like there was a sense of rootedness in here. This was where my parents were. So I guess it's when I myself left and moved to the UK. And where I was there was a sense of, okay, I'm a migrant here. There's nothing really that lets me be here except for the fact that I'm a student.
And to zoom in on culture shock, obviously you've experienced firsthand the variety in the cultures, languages, etc., across Asia, Middle East, and now Europe. Do you remember culture shock hitting you even between places like Muscat in Oman, Abu Dhabi, when you were younger, or were you kind of shielded from that because, as you said, you had your home waiting for you with your parents to sort of insulate you from the outside world?
I'd say between Oman and the UAE, even though there is a huge culture difference, I think there is a commonality in there being a huge population of Kerala migrants / expats there and here. So as much as my family didn't necessarily surround themselves just with people from Kerala going to an English school, I spent a lot of time. I guess it was both the English communities and the Kerala communities that were common in both places. So yeah, I think my biggest initial culture shock was moving back to India. So when I was 10, moving back to India, I think schooling especially was huge issue. Changing curriculum from the English curriculum that I was in Oman to the Indian curriculum was very, very difficult. Very difficult to kind of come to terms with, and initially we just weren't able to handle it. We had to leave the school. My mom had to homeschool us for a bit. So I think that was the first significant, which again is ironic given I was moving to my native country. So yeah.
And do you remember that shock also being cultural? Sorry, maybe rephrase that. Also being social, in as far as that's a very formative time for children, students, anyone really.
Yeah.
And not only were you being sort of displaced for your education, but also I imagine you had good friends in one location. You worked very hard to make. Vice versa. Do you remember that being like a social challenge, being the sort of non-Indian Indian returning to India?
A bit, but I think as kids we're so easily adaptable. And so very soon we were able to kind of change and say, oh, this is what the Indian kids are interested in. Let's latch onto that. And so it wasn't that tricky to kind of change. Again,
this is always seems like a very sort of silly point to make, but food also really matters, as you mentioned before. How important a role did that play in your ability to cope when you were abroad, when you were in foreign countries? Did you sort of also take refuge in the fact that you could enjoy your home comforts in the kitchen? Or is that a silly point that doesn't
No.
make a difference?
I think so. Again, weirdly enough, going back to India is where I guess this probably shows more our kind of childish fussiness and naivety. But when we moved back to India, I think my brother and I really were annoyed with not having access to our favorite childhood foods that we had here. So like we couldn't get, Baskin Robbins or, the cereals that we used to have here, or we couldn't get the kind of pasta or stuff. So that was what we missed more. And so as much as Indian food is incredible, I think we were more worried about what we were losing. And so, it was a struggle there. I think having moved to the UK, initially, this is something I actually had a thought about recently, which is about wanting to kind of carry your food over and the insistence of being able to make your food in a new country. And, air quotes doesn't really work in audio format. But like initially, for sure, I was trying to bring over as much stuff as I could in my suitcase every time to cook food from India or in England. And I still do. I still primarily cook Indian food, mainly because I'm trying to cook as much vegetarian food now. But I'd say I'm less insistent on trying to cook stuff that I grew up with and more just kind of embracing what I have where I am because it's more local. And I think at the end of the day, I love food so much, all food. So it doesn't have to be the food from my home country. I can learn to enjoy, and I have learned to enjoy British cuisine. And so I'm able to cook stuff that's more local or more regional, whether it be English or more kind of like stuff that I get that's from Europe as well. So food initially was something that I used, but I don't think it was necessarily a coping mechanism for missing home or anything. It was just practical.
Yeah. In some ways, I guess if you've been taken out so early in your life that it's not quite as big of you don't form that same relationship with your home country as you would if you spent the first 20 years.
Yeah.
We'll talk about your move to the United Kingdom shortly. The last thing on your time as a child, and perhaps I should invite them on to talk about this rather than you, but do you remember speaking to your parents about the decisions that they made on your behalf about where you and your brother would move to? Did they involve you in the process, saying, we're thinking of uprooting your life to move back to India or wherever? Or were you sort of just a passenger in that process? Because it's a really big decision for the parents as well on their own, not even considering the fact that their children are involved, right?
Yeah. So the first move, so I was born in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. And again, my parents were here because of my dad's work. And the move from Abu Dhabi to Muscat in Oman, that was purely determined by my parents, by the kind of consumerism that they observed in the UAE, and they thought we don't want our children to kind of grow up in that atmosphere. And they heard and saw that Oman and Muscat was much more grounded, much more outdoorsy. So I was 3 and my brother was just born, so we weren't going to help with the decision making there. So they made that move. When we moved back to India, that was more out of necessity. My dad had to get an eye surgery and he had to go back to India to do that. So he was out of work. So that was, we wouldn't have been able to stay in Muscat. Again, it wasn't a choice. I remember vividly my parents having to tell me, look, this is happening, we're going to have to leave. But it wasn't really a choice. Moving back to Muscat was, again, determined by my dad's job. He had the surgery and he was able to find work. So again, but that was more of an excitement. They knew we'd be on board for that. And then finally, it was kind of full circle. Born in UAE, moved to Oman, moved to India, moved back to Oman, and then for my A-levels, we moved back to the UAE. So at that stage, that was again determined by my dad's job. We had to move because of that. And, I guess we were a bit more involved in that one. We didn't want to disrupt my kind of GCSE years. And at that stage, I think they were more confident in who we were as children to be able to kind of manage the lifestyle in Abu Dhabi. That one was fine as well.
Yeah. Was it always expected by your family and friends that you would migrate abroad for university? Because you don't really have a home country to study in, if that makes sense. Most people have I've had a good education in my home country, and the normal route is I'll continue in this country all the way until the end of my education. Yeah. But I guess for you, it didn't really have that same sort of weight, I guess, in a way, or maybe it did. I don't know.
No. I think by the time we were thinking about university, which I guess was year 11, start of year 12, I think outside of financial considerations, it was my dad's new job in the UAE that would have allowed us to go to the UK for uni. Outside of that, I think it made most sense to go there for university, and it didn't really occur to me to go to India. Yeah.
And did you at any point consider not going to the UK specifically because you went to University of Leeds? But was there any part of you who thought, well, because I haven't got this home, shall we say, I have the freedom to be able to choose basically anywhere?
Yeah. I think, again, large part of it was friends. Most of my friends were going to England. Again, I was privileged enough that my family were in the position to be able to afford to send me to the UK. They weren't able to afford to send me to the US, which I wasn't ever keen on, but it was another option that a lot of international school kids went to. But I think UK, because of my schooling, because of my friends, that was the only real one I considered. I never really thought about anywhere else in Europe because of the language, because of the culture. I think I did consider this question has sparked memories that I think I did at one point consider Singapore.
Wow.
Because
really?
I'd visited when I was like 12 and I had a cousin that lived there. And at that time of my life, who I was then, I really loved Singapore as a nation and how it functioned. So I think that was something I considered. But I think it was more in case it doesn't work out in the UK. Or maybe it was just another option. But I think in the end, it was just easiest to go with the UK.
And you chose in the end, spoiler alert to the audience, you chose the UK University of Leeds in the end to study economics. And I want you to take me back to the day that you left. Do you remember how you were feeling? Do you remember how your family were feeling? Do you remember how you felt when you were at the airport saying goodbye to your family? Was it excitement, homesickness, nervousness? How would you describe that time generally?
I honestly can't remember the days leading up to it at all. It wasn't very emotional. It didn't feel like a big deal. It just seemed like, oh yeah, this is going to happen. which is crazy. I don't know why. I really don't know why it didn't feel like a major thing. It just seemed so natural, and it just seemed... I think in many ways, like, I knew in a few months' time I'd be coming back to visit over Christmas. And maybe it was just I was so excited. Maybe I was just really, really excited for you in Leeds, that I wasn't really that bothered about having to leave the UAE. Again, I didn't... Even then, I didn't have an attachment to the UAE, even more so now. But yeah, arriving in Leeds, I've been to the UK once before, which was on a family trip a few years before. And yeah, it just felt so... it was fine. Like, I'm sure I'm kind of glossing over some clashes that I had then, which I can't really remember now, but everything just really went smoothly. I moved with my mum. We managed everything. We found it really easy to use, like, stuff that was new to me then, which was going on public transport. Here it's such a failing public transport system, but yeah, they're like using all that. It was pretty straightforward, and I kind of assimilated quite easily. Again, most of my friends at school were English, so that side of it, moving into halls and stuff, wasn't really a challenge. So
Interesting.
yeah.
I find that absolutely fascinating, because sort of UK students will find that moment where they're leaving home, even if it's an hour and a half by car up the road, to be one of the most sort of stressful and difficult decisions to make in that moment. Obviously, long term, you look back on it with rose-tinted glasses, but in the moment, they're really struggling. And there you were, moving halfway across the world, essentially.
Yeah.
For 4 years minimum.
Yeah.
And I know you had links to the UK before, but I
don't
wonder...
have any blood relatives in the UK.
Yeah.
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 I think part of it, Ollie, may have been, as much as I love my family and spending time with them, I think I really, really sought that freedom. And I knew, like, in terms of expressing myself, that wasn't happening in the UAE. So it was the excitement, I think, just overrode everything. And there's so many things I was looking forward to with societies. And, I think, again, having grown up in English culture and not having experienced it firsthand, so many things in terms of sports and music and nature that I want to explore. So
migrating for the sake of expressing yourself and freedom is a really interesting angle to take on why people make that decision, to the positive reasons people make the decision to move abroad.
Yeah.
I wonder, for you now, with the knowledge you have of what life in England is like, or in the UK is like, foreigners, if you were to be in your parents' position at some time in the future, and you were to be doing the same thing, dropping your child off at the airport, and they were just like, yes, let me at it. I have absolutely no regrets. I'm not going to miss home at all. This is where I see my future being, and there was no sort of contemplation.
Yeah.
Would you have the same sort of, like, go for it? Or would you now, looking back now, be a little bit like, wow, okay, he's very enthusiastic, but he hasn't quite worked out the ups and downs that come with being so far away from home?
I mean, I'd love to say that I'd be fully for it, and I think I would be.
It's
hard to put myself in that shoe, to be fair.
Yeah. What I was trying to get at is that it's almost as much of a credit to your parents as it is to you for having the wherewithal to give you the freedom, and also your brother too, at 17, 18, to be, okay, like, we trust you guys if this is what you want to do with your lives, to be able to go and to make it work.
I think I'm giving myself a lot of credit here. I was a very responsible, organized kid. So I think for them, they knew I was going to crack on, make the most of the opportunity, be mature about it. So they weren't that worried. And also, my brother was at home, so it wasn't like, when my brother left, it was like, whoa, now it's just the two of us and the dog. So it wasn't a huge kind of presence or kind of change in the house with like no kids around anymore. So yeah, I mean, again, I probably have to. That's an interesting question that I'd like to ask them, but yeah, I believe from things they've spoken about, that's probably why. Yeah.
I only ask because if I think to the reality of what it means to move countries, often without really a fixed plan, without real full knowledge of what it actually will mean for you.
Yeah.
If I'd have had the knowledge of what it was going to be like before I'd actually made the decision to leave, I would have definitely approached everything very much differently and been a lot more skeptical of those things. Right. And I want to link this into something else that you mentioned in your diary. You speak a lot about belonging, and you speak about frequently being the only ethnic minority in a public space. I wonder, drawing on the huge positives and also the negatives that come with being a migrant, I'm very fortunate that I get to migrate as a desirable migrant, which a previous guest mentioned as a concept, where a white man, university education, etc., they're exactly the kind of migrants that we want. Whereas you, as a brown man, don't fall into that category. How did that sort of feed into your decision-making process? And were you aware of the position that you would be unfairly given before you arrived in the UK for university?
No. I really wish I had been more kind of aware of the immigration situation in the UK and what would be required from me to be able to stay afterwards. Yeah, I think in terms of, I just think, I assume, and I don't know why, that if I was qualified and I was, if I could prove myself to be worthy for a position over an English, a local, that was all that mattered. And so it doesn't matter if I was an Indian. That was it. But yeah, the whole world of sponsorship was made quite clear to me in the last couple of years. And yeah, so that's changed things quite a bit. But I definitely wish I'd known about it before.
Yeah. And how soon after your arrival in the UK did that become sort of plainly aware? Was there a version of you who was sort of running on this sort of naive high that everything was going to be absolutely fine and it didn't matter what color your skin was?
Yeah.
And then was there a moment that you remember where you sort of had to take a step back and think, oh, okay, so this is the reality of living in a predominantly white country?
So I'd make the distinction between the kind of skin color and its impact within a social space and my passport being Indian. I think the skin color, and for me, I didn't notice it at all when I was at uni, both when I was in diverse spaces or when I was not, when I was volunteering with Yorkshire Cricket Foundation, and I was me as a 19-year-old Indian boy and 25, 70-year-old white Yorkshire people, Yorkshire Yorkies. Yorkies. That just, it didn't kind of strike me at all back then. Whereas, I think the Indian national, like being an Indian national, that became like a real barrier within the last few years where it's like, oh shoot, when I want to apply for a job, that is going to hold me back. Like, that is a real disadvantage I face. It's not the fact that my skin is brown. It's not the fact that I am, it's just my passport. So, in terms of my skin being brown, that's something I've noticed more in the last year, where, I don't know, I think it's partly moving out of London, where being in a space where I am more frequently the only ethnic minority. And now, I don't know if it's more the fact that I am non-white, or it's more to do with just where I've reached in my kind of perception of social situation. I don't know, but I feel a bit more alienated and isolated now in those spaces than I did previously, which is, just another factor. But yeah.
We had, obviously, previous guests have spoken very candidly about the daily discrimination that they face in the UK more recently.
Yeah.
Have you also had experiences of sort of the day-to-day sort of undercover discrimination that other guests have faced? Or, as you said, is the majority of the stuff that you faced more on a sort of a bureaucratic level where you feel like you're just as qualified as anybody else in the country, but just by the virtue of the name on top of your passport, it's become impossibly difficult for you to try and make it work?
Yeah, definitely the latter. I really can't think of any instance where I felt the kind of, my appearance or my name or anything was a real kind of, point of aggression or anything. Recently, obviously being a school teacher, and there's not many brown teachers at the school I'm at, I expected more based on the demographics of my school. There have been a few instances, but I think it's more the case of kids wanting to use anything to kind of distract and try and derail a lesson. So I wouldn't call that. It never felt personal. It was just like, oh, I'm going to try and use this to try and, get under your skin. So that's only, those have really only been the example that I can think of. Outside of that, nothing.
Yeah, just for people who maybe can't relate to what it's like to be in that position, what are the things that, as you said, you can just sort of brush off as they're just trying to get under my skin because they're kids, and you don't have to quote it word for word because I realize there's privacy issues about what's said at school. But the kind of things that they'll make comments about, which you can say that's just them being kids, but maybe for people who've never experienced any form of discrimination before, wouldn't be able to have that same reaction to.
Yeah. I think the extremely low level thing, which I would get on the hallways and I was super easy to brush off, was I was constantly said, oh, you look like a teacher we had last year. And the only connection was that he was brown as well. And so it was a super easy connection with them to make, very lazy one. And I was like, okay, I'm constantly just being compared to this guy. And the only thing he was also brown. I think higher level stuff in a few lessons that I've run, it's been, making the typical kind of Indian noises. Again, I have to use air quotes there. More like, singing Indian songs for no apparent reason. They're kids. So it's not like smart racism. It's just dumb racism, where it's just like making silly noises or silly jokes. So again, that helps kind of brush it off.
So is there a possibility that you have learnt to just brush it off because you don't really have a choice in that sense? Because if, I don't know, I feel like if sort of the high and mighty English person was in a school in India and they were attributed those things, it wouldn't be so quite as comfortable just to be like, yep, well, that's just how it is, and carry on with your day. Like, I was just reinforcing it's okay to be sort of upset about the fact that you're considered to be exactly the same as the other brown person who they know from the right. Like there are lines there to draw, right?
Yeah, but I think again for me it's just they're kids, and so if this was an adult, I would 100% call them out on it because they should know better. And with the kids, when it's an appropriate moment for me to raise it, and knowing that it's not just a tactic for them to kind of distract or derail a lesson, I will call them up on it and explain it in a manner that doesn't seem kind of aggressive. But for sure, when it's not targeted at me, and I've seen someone kind of in someone else brush off things, I've tried to call other people out on it, because it is those small things which, if you keep brushing off, they can just become the norm, which we don't want.
And we're going to zoom in now on what you said about the fact that sometimes you feel that the bureaucracy in itself can be discriminatory against Indian citizens.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us about the bureaucratic journey that you've been on to try and contribute as a very skilled, multilingual person to the UK economy?
Yeah.
Because I know, obviously, we mentioned the fact that you're training to become a teacher.
Yeah.
But that was actually a response to other things going on bureaucratically, right? So can you just take us through that odyssey that you've been on and the hurdles you've had to jump over to try and contribute to the country that you've given so much to?
Yeah. So initially, again, I was working at a job which I thought would be able to sponsor me. It was at a company which had the power to sponsor me, in a sense, because of its scale. And we weren't able to get it organized due to issues within the team. The team wanted to hire, keep me going. But I think a year into the job, I already knew I wanted to look elsewhere. And that was where the issue really came. I still thought at that point we could get it to work at the company that I was at. But looking elsewhere, that's where it really hit me when I was looking. So many places did not sponsor. And what really hurt me was none of the things that I wanted to do would sponsor. And it really showed what the UK, and this is common amongst so many other nations, and to be fair, you kind of mentioned it in your question as well, contribute to the economy. That really frustrated me. I understand within the confines of the system that we're working in, growth and everything is important. But the fact that the only validation for someone to be in a country is providing economic worth was really is something I found really kind of just disgusting. It didn't matter how wonderful a person you were and how you could impact the society and impact within arts or impact within, even just what you can do within a community or there's so many other things you can influence as a person outside of driving economic growth. And yet that's not valued. And then the new regulation came in the UK late last year, where it was like, look, now it's even more clear what we want. We only want, this is not defined within the laws, but basically within the confines of the regulations, only financial institutions and really high-paying jobs can hire graduates out of uni, which, limits graduate sponsorship to London, which limits it to finance and other high-paying services, which again shows this is what we prioritize as an economy, which is really disappointing to see. So it wasn't a positive experience at all. Teaching, luckily aligned with all my values and my personality and something that I wanted to do. And not because it necessarily aids economic growth. I guess it does. But I think more out of a necessity for teachers, it also provides an avenue for sponsorship in the UK. So in that sense, it worked out. But it was a very frustrating kind of experience.
Yeah. Two things I want to dig out from what you just said. Firstly, teaching itself is just the most fundamental thing for an economy to thrive. If you haven't got the workforce with the skills, social skills, not just intellectual skills, but social skills, etc., to fill the jobs that need to be done, then the basis for your economy is gone. And then secondly, it's really, really, I love the point that you made about the fact that it's not just a question of economics, right? Like you, I would say, have done more social good having studied in the UK, having paid for the right to study and live in the United Kingdom with your free time, than many people who sort of take that for granted just being a UK citizen, staying here, from the volunteering that you did, and even the things which maybe aren't quite as tangible, like the fact that the kids who are at the school you're teaching at now, they will now have somebody diverse to look up to and to introduce them to other ways of looking at things. And I think that point that you made is just such a clever and astute one, is that perhaps it needs to be a bit more holistic, the system, and it's not just based off of your salary. It's okay, well, what have you actually contributed more widely to society? And are you net improving all aspects of society?
Is wonderfully kind of, it would be wonderful to have that as an element to be considered. But obviously from a governmental, bureaucratic point of view, that's almost impossible to measure, right? Which again is an issue with the wider system, which is unfortunate. And I can't really imagine how that could be changed, except for a complete dismantlement of how it works. But it is a shame that those things aren't an influence.
I don't want to engage in too much of what if-ery. But if you hadn't managed to find the PGCE to get another visa to stay for whatever reason, what do you think you'd be doing right now? Because as far as the audience now will hopefully now realize, you'd been here at university, you've been working here for a few years, and then you were sort of had this hurdle in front of you, had maybe made even higher. What would you have done? Would you have gone back to India, I guess? Sort of. How much of a sort of a heart-sinking moment was that when you realised that there maybe was this uncertainty around if you could stay in the UK?
Initially, it was really difficult. I think when this new policy came out, December 2023, it was a huge shock to my system, and it was a very existential moment for me. So the options I considered and settled on in the end, and slowly at one point did form and present a source of liberation and excitement, was either moving to India and being able to do what I really wanted to do. Again, as I mentioned, I was in the UK. It was still very difficult to find anything that I wanted to do that would sponsor me. So working in a space that I really valued and was passionate about, that was an exciting move. So moving back to India, the only country that would take me unequivocally, and then potentially trying somewhere new. So I did consider Europe, but I think the language barrier was still a bit too much for me. And I'm not wonderful at picking up languages. So I think I was considering places like Australia, not the US or Canada, but I think, to be fair, after a while of considering Australia, I realised there were some of the same issues affecting migrants moving to the UK, affecting those moving to Australia, and it would have been a case of me trying to look for jobs that I wasn't keen on anyway. So I'd imagine India would be where I was, where I would have been.
Yeah, interesting. One of the reasons that I have so much love for this project that's happening, trying to get people with experience of migrating to tell their stories, is, and I guess this sums up your experience really nicely, is to try and encourage people to see statistics and numbers on pages as individual people with individual stories, with individual qualities of how they can contribute. And if you were, rather than ministers looking at statistics about migration, if it wasn't just one, which was you, it was Achu, with experiences here, here, and here, speaks these languages, has done this studying, achieved these grades, has contributed to this local cause in Yorkshire, etc. I would dare say that on almost every single point of those things, it would be, well, that person's actively contributed. That person's actually contributed. That community was much richer for having this person here. And if you make it a little bit more personal, then who knows? Hopefully, it would start to be a little bit more friendly.
100%.
Final question before I get you to read out your diary for the listeners. you finish your diary entry asking about where you currently, where do you belong? Where will you belong? And how being a migrant is sort of an unanswerable question of always trying to work out that push and pull between, do I feel at home here? Do I feel at home there? And what does it even mean to be at home? Do you think that's something that you will ever receive closure on? Or do you think it will, for you, given where your childhood is, you won't ever have the answer to, oh, okay, so this is where I was meant to be, if that makes sense?
I think time will tell. I think in 30 years' time, if I've been in the UK for that long, I may quite strongly say and feel very, very at home in the UK and belonging to the UK. I will still have strong connections to Kerala in India, but I don't think I would view it as, again, in 30 years' time, it probably would feel even more foreign than it does feel for me right now. So it'll be interesting to see. But already I feel those were questions I grappled with during this kind of time of uncertainty. Now, they're a bit more clear for me where these places hold in terms of their personal, where it fits in my space. So, but with more time, I'm sure it will become even more clear.
Well, all I can say is that you'd be a credit to anywhere that you end up being. And if a country like the UK doesn't want you for whatever reason, that's more bad on them. Achu, can you please read your diary entry?
Dear diary, why do I feel foreign in my home country? The only country where I'm unequivocally... Rewind. The only country where I'm unequivocally free to stay. The only country which speaks my native tongue. The only country where the majority of people look like me. And why do I feel at home in a country thousands of kilometers away, where in my current city, I'm most frequently the only ethnic minority in a public space? Why do I feel my interests, values, and, the big word, culture is most aligned here? Why do I feel no love towards the nations where I grew up? Without the family and friends there, why do I feel no inclination to visit them? Will they ever have a place for me in my future? Where do I belong? Where will I belong? When will I belong? Being a migrant, for me, is about grappling with these questions and the ones above. Many have become clear to me, and for some, I'm still seeking answers.
Achu, thank you so much.